you go. The men, the myths, the legend, Caleb Maupin and Haas. How you guys doing?
Great.
Good. How about you, Jackson?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for being here. You know, we didn't really like talk too much before as to like how we wanted to dive into this, but given that I just kind of gave that brief summary, I maybe each of you could go one at a time, and Caleb, maybe you first, and discuss your general thoughts on the tweet that was put out by myself and the reaction that unfolded.
Well, sure. What immediately comes into my head, many times I have had this image in my head of, some average American family enjoying their afternoon, and then there's someone's knocking on the door. Opens the door. Hello, I'm from the local communist organization. Oh, okay, great. Well, tell me what your group believes in. Well, we think that everyone in this town is a dirty, rotten Euro settler, and your living standard is too high. So we want to drive down your living standard to make it more fair to people in the third world. And while we're at it, we are planning to engage in violence and property destruction tonight and tear this town apart, light some buildings on fire. You'll come with us, right? Oh, and while we're at it, we love drugs. We think drugs are amazing. Is anyone in your family addicted to opioids or heroin or marijuana yet? We want to get them addicted to it because drugs are just awesome. And while we're at it, have any of you considered becoming sex workers? Prostitution. We are all about that. That is our central issue. So will you sign up and join our group? Now, of course, I'm being hyperbolic. No one literally does this. And I think that is the essence of the problem. That is the essence of the problem right there, because I have done actual political work. I have knocked on people's doors. I have sold people newspapers. And you realize that, it seems pretty basic that in politics, the way to get people to support you is to make the case that you're going to make their lives better. People generally vote for candidates that they think are going to improve their lives. People generally support political movements, political ideologies that they feel will improve their lives. However, unfortunately, a lot of our politics on the so-called left has degenerated not into a program and a strategy for actually dismantling imperialism, building a socialist world, but rather kind of an identity that people can buy into. They can be on the internet, they can feel really radical, they can be very angry at the society around them, they can give voice to their very, very, very pent-up, angry feelings of rage. They don't fit in with the society around them. They realize that there are evil things that go on and other people don't realize them, and they're frustrated, so they feel alienated. That's not real politics. And look, national chauvinism, I've heard that my whole life. This is the greatest country in the world. And if you so much as ask people, like, why is the United States the greatest country in the world? They look at you and go, what? You don't think it's the greatest country in the world? You must be brainwashed. Everybody knows. We all hate that, okay? We all hate national chauvinism. We all hate jingoism. We all hate this idea that the United States is this infallible country that's never done anything wrong. Slavery, Jim Crow segregation, murder of Native Americans, Korea, Vietnam. There's been horrendous things that have gone on in the history of the United States, and we offer no support for that, obviously. But while all of those things were going on, while slavery was going on, there were people like Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman and John Brown. When there was exploitation in the sweatshops, you had Gus Hall, you had William Z. Foster, you had Eugene Debs, you had the labor movement. You had people organizing for the rights of women. During the Vietnam War, you had people who burned their draft cards and said, hell no, we won't go. You had people that ran through the streets of the city that I'm in right now, New York City, with the flag of the National Liberation Front of Vietnam, chanting, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win. And I would argue that the anti-war activists and the suffragists and the labor movement and the abolitionists and the anti-racists are just as much a part of the history of this country as are the war makers and the colonizers. And that socialism, when it comes to the United States, will be this progressive current in American history, taking power and mobilizing to dismantle imperialism, build a whole new world, raise people out of poverty, and build a better life for people around the world and for people in this country. I think that's a pretty winning message that I would be comfortable knocking on somebody's door with. So forgive me if I was a little bit provocative there, but I couldn't resist.
No, I love it. I think that was very well said. And it reminded me of what Michael Parenti once said. He said, this is our country and we have to fight to take it back. So Haas, Oh, and for anyone in the audience, let me know how my mic is. People were saying it was a little bit loud at the start, but Haz, your thoughts on the initial tweet and the reaction that came after it?
Yeah, I think we really need to delve a little deeper in terms of Caleb is 100% entirely right that they do have a losing strategy and they have a strategy of failures. Basically, people who cannot win the masses and cannot win in this country. But a more fundamental problem with leftists is they actually don't uh, care. They say, well, we don't want to win. We just want to be right. And as a matter of fact, winning among the masses in America would be a bad thing because the masses in America are a bunch of settlers upon whom we can only desire misfortune and disaster and punishment, divine retribution for the sins of the fathers. So I think we should walk it back a little bit and actually assess the fundamental controversy from the standpoint of the history and experience and theory of Marxist-Leninism. Because it's not just that, as Caleb pointed out, that adopting American patriotism is the winning strategy. It's also fundamentally correct and principally correct from the standpoint of Marxism-Leninism. So now, one of the first ways we can ground the controversy is this. What is the soil of socialism or Marxism or communism? Is this soil the abstraction of individual morality set against the world? Or is it the actual given majority, overwhelming majority of people that preside and live within your country? Where does socialism become real? Where does it become relevant? What is the class struggle? Is the class struggle an abstraction of thought? Or is it something whose context is inevitably national and civilizational and so on and so on? Now, there's the example of history. This controversy actually isn't being brought up for the first time in history. Actually, Marxism-Leninism is what came to define itself significantly on this basis of this precise question. What is the real ground of the class struggle? So the first form of this was when Lenin refused to recognize that the westernized city elites in Russia were the sole primary and privileged site of the class struggle. Lenin elected to recognize that the national Russian peasantry, the democratic petty bourgeoisie, as he put it, was the site of the fundamental class differentiations that were only apparent in the cities. The real essence of those differentiations were happening in the countryside. And then through the course of the experience of the Bolshevik Party, a term came to be adopted which was called liquidationism. Now, liquidationism was a phenomena that basically was this trend and tendency, whether for coming from the left or from the right, that when there's a new historical situation, to just completely basically abandon the entrenched wisdom accumulated by the party and its experience. And let's just liquidate the party's program, liquefy the party's tradition and continuity, and let's just start from scratch. The reason I'm bringing that up is because in the 20s, and this actually forms a significant part of the origins of Stalin's socialism in one country, and what we call Stalinism itself, was actually happening in the sphere of aesthetics. So many of the more radical figures of revolutionary culture within Russia were pushing for this idea called proletarian culture, prolet cult. And the basic idea was that the old Russian culture was completely stained by the sins and wrongness of the past, and we need to create a brand new proletarian culture. And the majority of Bolsheviks responded to this prolet cult, this idea that was being pushed, with the accusation that it was a form of liquidationism. But instead of being a form of liquidationism against the party, it was a form of liquidationism against the entrenched experience of history itself, specifically in the form of Russia's national traditions, Russian literature, and also European literature, and so on and so on. So Lenin responded to these people by saying, listen, we need the Russian people to be accultured at the bare minimum with the works of civilization, with all of the treasures of mankind. from the European Enlightenment to Russia's own traditions and so on and so on. We cannot cede Russia's national traditions to the enemy. We have to give them new meaning because we're actually the ones inheriting them. So they applied this accusation of liquidationism, which was first levied against detractors from the party, to those people who were trying to invent a brand new culture. So I think an important detail here is the fact that the past, and one last thing, I don't mean to ramble, but the opponents of American patriotism will point out, well, that's very well and fine. Russia was a real civilization and a real country that was founded based on some kind of authentic tradition, whereas America was a kind of settler colony that was founded on the basis of pure abstraction, right? It's the United States, it's the Constitution with its negative rights. It doesn't really have a substantive reality per se. And they will say on that basis, we cannot apply the same logic to America. And with that, I think one should be very careful to acknowledge that the same logic could be applied to communism or socialism itself. Communism and socialism is not readily possessed of a substantive content. It's kind of the same way, a kind of abstraction. And that's why I think in countries like the United States, communists not only have to follow the example of the Bolsheviks and of Marxist-Leninists in other countries, we should also recognize that communists are, within the United States, uniquely privileged with the ability to give new meaning to the so-called American project. What was 1776 about? What was this United States? To a point where we should recognize that the goal of communism is not only to give new meaning to those things, but also to inherit them, to also succeed them and be what they were always meant to be, if that makes sense. Like, represent what the meaning of 1776 and the United States of America is. And as far as substantive cultural and civilizational realities, only then can the authentic civilizational realities that encompass the United States, whether it's the Latin American culture or Spanish culture in the South, or indigenous cultures, or black culture, or Appalachian and the European culture, all of these things can be given more authentic, substantive expression by a communist-led United States. Because communists are uniquely endowed with the ability to recognize that the abstract formalism of the bourgeois state of the United States is not enough to address the deeper, national realities. And this was the case in the Soviet Union, and it was the case wherever communists ruled. They were especially attuned and sensitive to the fact that it's not enough to declare yourself a universal state and a universal party. You have to address the specific national realities. So in no way is acknowledging the continuity of the United States of America and seeking hegemony over it incompatible with recognizing the specific national realities, or whatever you want to call them, within America, whether it's Spanish, indigenous, black, or also European. So, yeah.
Can I add something?
Go for it.
I should have started with this, actually, and I apologize because my mind slipped. But I want to say this. When I was in Cleveland, there was a local activist named Cheryl Lesson, and she was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Maoist group, and she went to prison for 2 years for lighting an American flag on fire. And that was wrong. And there's been various attempts to outlaw flag burning in the United States, and I would be the first to protest against that. People have the right to express themselves in that way. And I will add that the first people to burn the flag in protest in the United States were African Americans. It was Marcus Garvey. And while I think that proletarian patriotism and such is a very good strategy that we should adopt, I respect the right of any colonized person, any black person, any Chicano person, any indigenous person to burn the flag, to say that they are not an American, to argue that they need to have their self-determination and a national territory. and that my belief in proletarian patriotism as an overall strategy is not a negation of that in any conceivable way, right? And I want to also talk about how cheap some of this can be, right? Because I support all Black nationalism, whether it's the Uhuru movement, Minister Farrakhan, the MOVE organization. I support all Black nationalism, and a lot of the people criticizing us don't. I support all anti-imperialist states: Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, any country that's fighting for its independence against imperialism. I support them. A lot of people criticizing us don't. And that this, demonstration of I hate America, I want nothing to do with America, oh, look how revolutionary I am, is really fake if you don't actually support Black nationalism, if you don't actually support Iran and Cuba and Venezuela, if you accuse people who criticize the Syrian anti-Syria propaganda about chemical weapons, if you accuse them of being Nazis, you have no right to criticize us on that ground and say we're pro-imperialist because we won't tweet, F the USA on social media. And that it's really kind of childish to think that you can make up for not really being anti-imperialist in your politics by virtue signaling with this, this kind of teenage rebellion verbiage, which is what a lot of this really is. Because at the end of the day, support for actual anti-imperialist forces, that's what makes you anti-imperialist.
Yeah, very good points. Very good points. I have a few things I want to pick your minds on, but the first one is that, and Haas, you kind of brought this up a little bit, is that a lot of people have been saying like, well, you can't be an American patriot because of reasons X, Y, or Z, because of it being a settler colony or it being an imperial power, the imperial power right now on the globe. And what I think a lot of people don't understand is that, the Red Lettuce brought this up on their Twitter. Actually, I'll put it up for everyone so you can see. They said, ultras love to misinterpret revolutionaries. Russia was a former imperial empire. Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, etc. were all settler states, and their revolutionary movements used proletarian patriotism to rally the masses to form a worker state. But U.S. workers can't. Get the fuck out of here. So I'm curious, I'm curious your thoughts on that hypocrisy that we've seen from so many ultras, just like continuing to tout that line that like, oh, you can't be a patriot because of like this or that reason. But then they go off supporting socialist causes in the countries that have a very, very, not a similar history, but like in the way that they're pointing out, it is a similar history, be it because of it being a settler state or it being an imperial power. So, Caleb, you want to address that first?
Sure. If Haas wants to go first, since I've
spoken.
Or
either of you, yeah.
Sure. I guess I'll just be a little bit quick. I think this precise question, can be so adequately addressed from the perspective of dialectical materialism, again, which is within the arsenal given to Marxist-Leninists. Now, from the perspective of dialectical materialism, that also entails a unique view of morality. So from the dialectical materialist perspective, no one is an abstract, universal moral agent devoid of any material or substantive base for their existence. No one is out here just representing some kind of abstract mind floating above reality. So when people are expressing habits and attitude and ideologies, they are taking as their basis real material premises. And among those premises are national premises. They're premises that belong to one country. It's not a coincidence that so many leftists are just so uniquely American. It's such a uniquely American phenomena to care about Jay Sakai and all this kind of stuff. And that's not a coincidence, right? It's coming from those real premises. From the dialectical materialist perspective, the notion that America as a whole can be condemned on the basis of its immorality as a whole is an absurdity, because morality belongs to the sphere of an agent's will and intervention in the present tense, here and now, right? Not in the past, but here and now, in the present tense. And if American leftists, because, to clarify, dialectical materialism is a kind of ontology of reconciliation, which means you cannot say there's a founding sin of America and then everything henceforth is sinful. At one point, you have to sober up and be able to reconcile yourself with the fact that the reality of America has endured. It has endured the test of time. It has become an irreversible material part of people's way of life, people's means of life, and people's reality. You cannot spit on the hand that feeds you and clothe yourself and feed yourself and support your entire existence on the basis of these material premises, and then pretend that you're completely absolved from having to engage or confront them in any kind of way. Like, oh, I'm not an American patriot, I'm not an American, even though America is the basis of your existence. It's the basis of your reality, and it's what's contextualizing your position in the first place. The dialectical materialist perspective forces the individual not to blindly accept everything done in the name of America or the American government or America's representatives, but just confront your own material premises, own up to them, and acknowledge them. And that's how I interpreted Jackson's tweet when he said he's an American patriot. He's owning up to the fact that he is an American, he lives in America, and Marxism-Leninism or communism for him means serving the American people. I don't see what context communism possibly could have beyond that. It's not a moral condemnation of the world, little less the material world. It is insight into material necessity itself. That if America has been around this long, if the American people have constituted themselves as such for this long, and you've taken that for granted as the basis for your existence, at what point do you have to make peace with that? Are you going to wage a war against reality for all eternity until you get the divine retribution where all of the settlers are, brought to justice by history or some other stupid thing? Like, and the disgusting hypocrisy is the fact they talk about and condemn Americans as settlers and say all these things, but then in effect and in practical reality, they end up serving the aims of the American deep state and the State Department, effectively being tools of American colonialism or imperialism more than anyone else. As Caleb pointed out, there's no one who has had more solidarity with Black national self-determination in the online ML sphere than Caleb. There's nobody who has been more persistently supportive and given solidarity to anti-imperialist forces globally. So we have to appreciate this irony. They are themselves repeating the it's like what you do not, what is it? You are doomed to that which you repress, you are doomed to repeat. By isolating themselves from the masses in the name of this Jay Sakai bullshit, whatever they're on, they are repeating the original sin of settler colonialism. They are making themselves settlers who are fortifying the ramparts against the masses and creating their own little pure community set against the American people. So we have to appreciate that irony. They are the most uniquely American phenomena in the world. You don't find leftists in Russia and even in Europe, at least when Europeans are not being Americanized, or elsewhere, Latin America or Africa. You don't see them, expressing these sentiments. It's a uniquely American phenomena. So sorry for rambling, but
well, I would like to add that, okay, first of all, we need to differentiate between a number of things, because as soon as you say this, you get immediately people start throwing a whole bunch of things and conflating a whole bunch of things at you. Okay, patriotism just means loving the land in which you live, wanting life to get better for the land or country in which you live. Patriotism refers specifically to a country, right? That's what it means. That's all patriotism means. That's patriotism. Nationalism is a different concept. Nationalism is loyalty to a nation. And the United States is not a nation. It's not a nation state. It's not Scotland. It's not France. It's not Germany. We are not, we don't have the attributes of a nation here. We don't have a common culture, a common background, a common language even. So we're not a nation. So you can't be a nationalist for the United States. And on top of that, national chauvinism is the belief that your nation or your nationality is superior to other nations and discriminating against other nations. So when you say you're a patriot, you're not being a nationalist, and you're definitely not being a national chauvinist. You're simply saying you want a better life and a better future for the country. And what is so frustrating is that people seem to argue that, saying you're a patriotic American that means blah, 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 blah. That means, oh, that you don't, blah, 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 blah. You don't recognize the country was founded on slavery. You don't, and it's like, no, all that means is we want a better life for the country. And at the end of the day, you can't really be an American patriot without being an internationalist. If you're really patriotic to this country, you want imperialism dismantled. You want a better relationship with countries around the world and an end to the exploitation of the third world. You want global relations based on win-win cooperation. You want an end to these wars. You want to break up the big corporations. That's really loving America. And if you're truly an internationalist, if you truly want what's good for the world, you would want the United States to move towards socialism and dismantle imperialism. And so there's no contradiction whatsoever. To truly be patriotic to this country, you must be an internationalist and an anti-imperialist. To truly be an anti-imperialist and an internationalist, you must be patriotic to this country. There is absolutely no confusion there. There's no contradiction between these terms. But people just continue and this is a great example of how it's another example of a very common trend, which is the internalization of our enemy's narrative. The most common example of this is the myth of the 20th century. I have heard my whole life, communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried, never had any success. Wow, China is the second largest economy in the world. Soviet Union industrialized, defeated the Nazis, Cuba's healthcare system. But no, it just failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And you would think when someone becomes a communist, they would be recognizing that that's not true. But they don't. I hear so many people say, oh, that's true, but I'm a special kind of communist. I read Marx myself, and I came up with like my own magical theory. So I accept your premise. I've just got my own. Well, this is what we're doing on this thing. We're internalizing. Our opponents have told us to be a communist means you're a dirty, rotten, unpatriotic enemy of the country. You're a traitor to the country. And we've internalized our enemy's narrative here. We've internalized this. Joe McCarthy had the House Un-American Activities Committee. And in the Communist Party of the United States, which was led by real organizers like William Z. Foster and Eugene Debs and Gus Hall and Bill Haywood and others, they went before the House Un-American Activities Committee and they said, this is an un-American committee. And they said, we're the real patriots. And this Congress is full of fifth columnists who supported the Nazis during World War II. It's full of poll taxers and racists and Jim Crow segregationists who are depriving people of their civil rights. We're the real Americans. And you accuse us of being violent revolutionaries. Maybe you've never read the Declaration of Independence, that calls for, maybe you've never read Thomas Jefferson. And they got up there and they said, we are not un-American. You're un-American. This committee is un-American. And that was the correct stance to take. That at the end of the day, people in the United States are going to identify as Americans, and they're going to want to make life better in their country. Historically, the way communists take power is not on the basis of their rhetoric. It's not on the basis of their ideology even. It's on the basis of their program. What are you for? The Bolsheviks were for peace, land, and bread. And the people of Russia and the surrounding countries supported them because they thought peace, land, and bread would improve the country, right? China was for land to the tiller. The Communist Party was for land to the tiller, land to the peasantry, a new China, breaking free from the imperialists, defeating the Japanese invaders. Well, the people of China supported the Communist Party because they thought the program of the Communist Party would improve things. At the end of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, in the second to last paragraph, he says that communists everywhere support every uprising against the existing order of things. That's every uprising, not just ones that are liberal, not just ones that are politically correct, not just ones that have a good view or a good demand, every uprising. But in all of them, they bring forth the property question as the leading question. So whenever people are at odds with the system in the United States, whether they're mad that their taxes are too high, whether they're mad about banks foreclosing their homes, whether they're mad about the wars, communists' job is to go to them and show support for them as having an uprising against the system, and then bring forward a program, demands that would challenge the question of property, that would move us towards socialism. That's what our job is. And if we want people to accept our program, they need to understand that the program will improve their lives. I mean, it's just kind of basic, right? I mean, this is just, so on the basis of our program, we should be formulating demands that will improve people's lives. When it comes to the issue of climate change, I have raised Fusion City, right? Right now, fusion energy is really the only hope for getting out of the nightmare of fossil fuels. We're not going to get out of it with windmills. We're not going to get out of it with solar panels. We need to construct a global, united effort to defeat fossil fuels, to harness the power of fusion energy. And that is a program. Build Fusion City, an international combined effort with Russia, with China, with Venezuela, with Iran, with India, South Africa, every country in the world working on fusion energy. Combine their efforts. Build a gigantic facility in the heartland of the United States of America to solve the problem of fossil fuels, get us off of fossil fuels once and for all with fusion energy, make it not a competition between countries, but a global unified effort to defeat fossil fuels. That's a program. Are you for it or are you against it? Well, if you're for it, we're going to have to challenge all kinds of capitalist power. We're going to have to push back the power of the fossil fuel corporations and the big banks. And we're going to have to team up with the Chinese communists and with Russia and with other countries to do it. So are you for it? Or are you against it? Well, if you're for it, that's a pretty darn patriotic program, isn't it? Isn't that a pretty patriotic program? When it comes to the issue of immigration, right? We talk about the Sandino-Zapata economic corridor. You know, there are people piling into the United States from Central America, from Guatemala, from Honduras. There are criminal organizations like MS-13 that have formed. There's dead bodies on the border every day. This situation can't continue, right? And Donald Trump and his big giant wall, that's not solving the problem because that makes those criminal gangs even stronger. If people can't walk across the border, they get smuggled in. The more afraid immigrant communities are, the more we have ICE kicking down doors, the more terrified people are going to be. That's not the solution. Liberals, they offer basically the same thing, right? It's not kids in cages now, it's children in facilities. That's what it is now. But it's the same thing when you get down to it. But we have a solution, which is the Sandino-Zapata economic corridor. The United States and Mexico and Nicaragua and China need to team up to economically develop Honduras and Guatemala. Jobs, schools, education, hospitals, effective teaming up with communities to fight the narco gangs. There needs to be an emergency program of economic development for Central America. And that would mean jobs in the southwestern United States, in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California. That would mean jobs in Mexico. That would mean jobs in Nicaragua, an economic corridor from the southern United States all the way down to Nicaragua, through Central America, through Mexico. That's a patriotic program. That would solve the crisis of mass migration on the border, the humanitarian issues. It would make us a lot safer. It would stop the flow of drugs into this country. That's a real solution. And it's a very patriotic solution. And it's on the basis of solutions like this that communists take power. And in order to have solutions that raise the question of property, in order to have those, you have to be patriotic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very well said. Very well said. I'm curious your thoughts on there was a stream. I think Hakeem may have said this, and they were talking about this whole debate, the patriotism debate, and they were discussing the fact that America has such a rich history of imperialism and settler colonialism. How could anyone call themselves a patriot when that is so much of what our history, American history, is? And I would obviously push back on that and say, well, no, like there's plenty of history that should be celebrated, right? And there's an active attempt by liberals today to try and erase that history from the minds of young Americans, right? But I'm curious to hear both of your takes on that, because it is, that is a true thing. Like there has been a lot of evil that has been done in the name of the American empire way before we were on this planet. So I look at it and I say, I want to celebrate and learn from and carry on the torch of good that this country has done. And I want to use that to improve the lives of my fellow Americans. And I want to reject the evil and also learn from the evil that has been done in our country's name, but reject that and take this country back. Haz, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I think, again, we should probably, this is an issue of, again, a very widespread confusion that self-proclaimed Marxists and Marxist-Leninism have on the question of morality. And morality is something we should take very seriously, because a lot of the mistakes come from not having a materialist perspective on the matter. Now, it's undoubtedly true that there was a unique evil. I will agree. There is a unique evil of European colonialism and specifically the colonization of America that is not even comparable to the forms of, aggression and slavery and so on of the pre-modern status quo. So I agree, there is a unique evil of this kind of modern European colonialism. No denying that. So it's not that I'm trying to say, like, well, this is the true for every single country's past and America is just no exception. No, I agree, it is a unique evil. The problem is it has already happened. It has already happened. And if we do not believe that this reality can be reconciled, that we cannot, so to speak, clean the mess, or at least help try to clean the mess created by the sins of the forefathers, there is no moral position that can judge the past in this way. In other words, America has created a mess, so to speak, right? With American settled colonialism and the genocide of indigenous and slavery. This, I agree, is all a mess created by America. But only as Americans can we clean the mess we created. Can we address this original problem? We're not going to address it by turning our backs on this country and its people and saying they're all evil and they're condemned. Because in effect, you are actively participating in that original evil by doing that and saying that. If we take responsibility for those original crimes, and I agree, America must take responsibility. And I'm not speaking in the form of atoning for its sins or rectifying the problem, but strictly in the sense, yes, we have to acknowledge this is part of the founding of America. We should own up to it. And if we cannot see how there can be a reconciliation and a redemption of the American project even after this, you're in no position to judge it from the perspective of morality. If we don't, we can at the same time own up to this hideous, ugly history and also believe that there is a reconciliation of this history, of this original wound. That is, to put it in this kind of Hegelian way, the wound is reconciled. This very original evil has a deeper meaning than just, meaningless barbarism, and it must amount to something more than that. And communists are uniquely disposed to being able to allow it to amount to more than that. And I think the form this takes is the United States because America, as Caleb pointed out, is not a nation. It's a union state. It's a union state of various different states, and it's in a state that, by the example of Stalin on the national question, is almost completely devoid of any specific national particularity when it comes to the pure form of the state. Obviously, there are national realities, but when it comes to the United States, it is devoid of any particular specific national content. What is more communist than that? Communists need to inherit that and give new meaning to it, to this form. And morality cannot be treated as something where, well, I may have not been around at that time of settler colonialism, but now I am uniquely able to, they like using this word, you're reproducing and you're reinforcing this settler colonialism by participating in it, by being a communist and admitting you're a patriot. This is a completely bankrupt mentality. It's a completely bankrupt moral or ethical position. You are already participating in it, whether you acknowledge and own up to it or not. Unless you want to leave this country and go live in a different country, it still forms the basis of your existence. You're doing it either way, right? You're not an abstract, ghost looking down upon the world. You're an individual who has real material premises, who has real premises in this reality and in this country. So when people try to treat morality as like an individual is the ultimate arbiter of every moral reality, and that moral action on part of the individual will is what defines an individual's morality, well, that's not a materialist perspective, because a materialist perspective says you are culpable and engaging in actions as an individual, whether you attribute them with the quality of moral will or not. As Marx puts it, men and women enter into relations independently of their will. They are doing it, but they don't know it, as Marx put it, right? You're being an American, you just don't know it and you're not acknowledging it. You're just as Your hands are just as dirty as anyone else. It's just that you're a hypocrite, right? So the point is, you are not pure or cleaning your hands or somehow morally correct by withdrawing from this reality and saying, "Oh, I want to create my own pure reality. This is a false reality." This is a complete. This is what kind of Hegel would describe as the beautiful soul. And since dialectical materialism comes from Hegelian dialectics, to put it in Engels' words, the standpoint of Marxism-Leninism to reality is that all that is real is rational, but not without further qualification. The meaning is, all that is real is rational, but not everything that is apparent is necessarily real. For example, as Mao used to put it, American imperialism is a paper tiger. Mao predicted that American imperialism would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, without any moral intervention on part of Americans whatsoever. So being opposed to imperialism doesn't mean that you're enacting some kind of, purely moral, prescription and imposing that upon reality. It means you are expressing insight into material necessity. You recognize that American imperialism and American racism and all these things, these hinder the forces of production that are waiting to be unleashed. These hinder the flow of history that is waiting to be realized. And it becomes a question of time. And the point of communism is to accelerate a process that is, in a sense, inevitable. And insofar as we're participating in this reality, the only moral thing to do is be true to what is already happening and being unleashed. American imperialism will collapse. All of the evils of America that we attribute to America will not last forever. But insofar as we're living in this world, the only will that can be expressed, that can be called moral, is one which acknowledges this and expounds this insight into action. So that's what I'll say.
Well, I want to add that, we shouldn't accept that all these things that have gone on in the history of the United States that were absolutely evil and wrong benefited the country. Slavery, for example, held back the industrialization and economic development of the United States. And that was one of the main motivations for the Civil War. The industrial capitalists were furious about the fact that in the South, they maintained an agrarian economy without industrialization. And there was a clash between the semi-feudal slave economy of the South and the rising industrial economy of the North. And if you look at the US South, the reason that even today, hundreds of years later, it is still poorer than the rest of the United States, it's still largely agrarian, it's still less developed, is because of the legacy of slavery. Now, that's not to say that wealthy white plantation owners didn't benefit from slavery, but if you look at the US South, overwhelmingly, the majority of the population of white people weren't benefiting from it. Black people certainly weren't benefiting from it, being, murdered and exploited and worked to death. They weren't benefiting from it. But the majority of white people weren't benefiting from it because they had the lowest wages in the country because they were competing with people who worked for free. And slavery overwhelmingly was bad for white workers in the South. And the defeat of slavery was a victory for the US economy overall. It led to unleashing industrialization in the country. And this is what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in his History of the United States. In his Black Reconstruction, he makes this point. And at the time that slavery was going on, it was labor unions and those who fought for the rights of workers that were the biggest opponents of slavery for this reason. Because even if these labor unionists were racist, they understood that slavery drove the wages of workers down. It hurt the U.S. economy. So by saying that that you can't be patriotic in the United States because of slavery, the strongest arguments against slavery at the time were being made by people who were arguing in the interests of the United States, and slavery hurt all working people in the United States. So that logic just doesn't add up. And this has been completely eroded. I watched, John Oliver, he did this piece about Confederate monuments. And if you watched the piece, you would think that slavery was good for Southern white people. It was good for Southern white people. They should just feel guilty about it. Well, that's bullcrap. It wasn't good for Southern white people. And the idea that slavery was good for Southern white people is propaganda that was invented by the Democratic Party. That was invented, it's Gone with the Wind, Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan. They did all of this stuff to rewrite history, to convince low-income white people that they were better off when slavery went on. But that was a big fat lie. And liberals now go around repeating this as if this is a fact. Oh yeah, well, slavery benefited all white people in the United States, and but they should just feel guilty and ashamed of this. That's not actually what went on. And this whole narrative, I've often criticized the book To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a really nice story. It's very touching. But it has absolutely nothing to do with the anti-racist struggles of the 1930s, right? It's, you have this town in the South, and there are these black people, and these black people couldn't possibly fight for their own rights. They're just helpless victims, and they're just these passive, helpless victims. And then all the poor white people are a bunch of rednecks and racists and all of that. And the hero is this wealthy white lawyer with a heart of gold who just steps in and tries to hold back all those poor white rednecks from their racism. That's not what happened in the 1930s. It takes place in the 1930s before the Second World War in the South. At that time, the Communist Party was going to the South and building labor unions of sharecroppers and textile workers of black and white. And Gus Hall and William Z. Foster and those folks were going around the South, and they were saying that racism and Jim Crow hurt all working people, and that they needed to build a fighting labor movement for the rights of all working people, and that Jim Crow hurt all workers, and that putting the needs of the black people at the front of the class struggle was a way to liberate all workers. And it was the white rednecks who were joining the same labor unions as the African Americans and teaming up together that shut down the state of South Carolina in 1934 and caused the National Guard to be sent in. You read the history of what went on in Alabama. Go read Hammer and Hoe by Robin D.G. Kelly. And it was the white poor people and the black poor people standing together and understanding that racism hurt all workers, and that putting the needs of black people at the front would lead to the liberation of all workers, that made the wealthy white lawyers and made the businessmen and the bankers panic, and made them panic and push racism and Ku Klux Klanism like you wouldn't believe, and also is part of what motivated Roosevelt to pass his popular reforms to try and calm the class struggle. So that's just, that book, To Kill a Mockingbird, it's not really about the 1930s. Every work of art reflects the period in which it was created, not the period in which it takes place. That reflects the mindset of the civil rights movement. And what was happening during the civil rights movement was that all over the world, in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America, the colonized people were breaking free. And they were breaking free, and the Soviet Union and China were the leaders of that global national liberation struggle. And to humiliate the United States and to expose the propaganda of the United States, they showed the picture of Emmett Till's mutilated body. They showed Jim Crow segregation, and they said the United States are a bunch of hypocrites. They say they believe in freedom. Look what they do to the black people. And in response to that, the richest capitalists in the northern wing of the Democratic Party, like the Kennedy family and others, said, okay, we need to fix this Jim Crow problem so we can have better optics. And that's what To Kill a Mockingbird is really about. It was the rich capitalists of the North saying, all right, we're going to go down south. Can you guys cut this out? We're trying to make them think we're the free country against the commies. That's what was really going on there. And that's what To Kill a Mockingbird is really about, okay? Mm-hmm. And this notion that the rich are the enlightened ones with the good values, and the poor people are all a bunch of, racist white trash who are all in the Klan, and the black people couldn't possibly fight for their own rights. Well, the only reason there was a civil rights movement was because before that, there was a black nationalist movement. There was Malcolm X. There was the Nation of Islam. And black nationalism and revolutionary politics was getting strong. That also motivated the northern wing of the Democratic Party to start working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others. So this notion that black people can't fight for their own rights, that's false. This notion that poor white people are these racist rednecks that need the rich people to control them, that's false. The whole narrative we have around this is all false. And this feeds into the mindset. A lot of American communists, the way they see this is that, they feel they don't fit in with this country, which I've felt that way my whole life. And many people feel alienated, especially now with the economy in crisis. A lot of young folks don't have a decent job, and there's a lot of social alienation and confusion, and they don't feel like they fit in. So they adopt Marxism so they can say, I'm the good American. All the Americans around me, you're evil. You're supporting the empire. You're Euro settlers. But I discovered the truth of communism on the internet, so I can sit on the internet and type away and call people racist and sexist all day and feel good about myself. Well, that's not real politics. That is not real politics. And that's what like third worldism is really about, right? Third worldism is a way and look, labor aristocracy is a real thing, right? I mean, there has been sections of the US working class that have benefited from imperialism and been bought off by it. That's a reality. But the reality of the period we're currently living in is the breakdown of the labor aristocracy. Those good paying jobs are gone. That white picket fence home that was the staple of the American dream of the 1950s has been foreclosed. It's boarded up. I mean, so to be screaming about labor aristocracy right now, I mean, yes, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that was a real barrier to popular organizing. Now, average Americans are ready to fight. Average Americans are against the wars. Average Americans think the government is working for someone else and not them. Average Americans are fed up. They want jobs. They want healthcare and education. Average Americans are ready to fight back. Now is not the time to say they're not ready to hear it. And if you think it's impossible, if you are in the mindset that it's impossible, we can never win over average Americans, so why even try? Stop, right? I don't take dating advice from incels. Okay, I don't take barbecuing advice from vegans. And if you think it's impossible, we can never win the American people to socialism, there is no hope, shut up. Go learn to play golf, maybe go join the alt-right. I don't know what you should do, but you shouldn't be a communist then, because communism is about winning. I mean, we actually want to see imperialism be dismantled. We feel we have an obligation here in the center of the empire to build an anti-imperialist working class movement. And if you don't think that's possible, I don't know what you're doing, and I don't know why you're trying to tell me how I should do something that you don't think is possible. If you don't think what I'm trying to do is possible and win Americans to anti-imperialism and socialism, then don't tell me how to do it, because you don't think it's possible.
Yeah, just one really final thing. I don't mean to, it's not going to be long, but I just want to say, I think a lot of this really, I don't mean to keep going back to morality, but it's almost like people just have this crazy cynicism about like, oh, how could something be both morally correct and human and at the same time benefit the people? Like, how could it be that slavery, is it just a coincidence? You're saying it's a coincidence that slavery just so happened to harm white people? Because they're in this state of frenzied liberal moralism where they want to feel like they're in the state of a pure will, divorced from material reality. Material reality is completely evil, and the only thing that is within the sphere of good is your voluntary will, right? But that's not a materialist perspective. A materialist perspective reconciles the will with material reality, which means, yes, what is ultimately good is what is good for the people. What is ultimately bad is what is bad for the people. This is Marx's Humanism 101. And Marx only thought the proletariat was significant because for him, the proletariat was the section of the people in Germany and elsewhere and in England that he thought represented the future and represented the fate of all the majority of the people in the class. He called them the ingenious soil of the people, right? So this idea that, oh, you're just a coincidence that, how can you say that imperialism and racism harms the American people? Wouldn't it be more convenient if they actually benefit from it and that I'm the only moral person because I'm the one who's in the know? Well, no, that's a completely idealist and false understanding of morality. And second, I just want to leave this on this. I'm not going to go into it, but I also think we should also reevaluate here the significance of the Popular Front in relation to this question of patriotism, because I think that's where communist parties worldwide started to really understand its significance. So that's it.
Yeah. One thing I've seen brought up by a lot of like leftists and not just like MLs, but leftists more broadly that supports the idea of being like a patriotic revolutionary is that the most patriotic stance on any given issue is to be on the left. It's not patriotic to want to send your brother, your son, your daughter, whoever into imperialist endless wars. It's not patriotic to want to ruin and destroy this country for the benefit of the top 1/10 of 1%. It's not patriotic to, allow 68,000 people to die every year because we don't have basic health insurance guaranteed as a human right. So I want to read this. This was actually a tweet that was put out by DC Metro CPUSA in response to everything that was being debated on Twitter. they said a word from an elder comrade. Fidel Castro once told a group of black nationalists and white students during the years of the Black Power movement and Vietnam War, who did not want to associate with the USA flag while other groups from other countries sat next to theirs. That the US flag is, did I skip one here? No, that the US flag is their flag. He then said that they cannot allow the US ruling class to own the flag. The working class of the US must fight for the flag, and once socialism is established, it is up to the workers to decide what they want to do with the flag in the United States as it exists. They go on here and talk more about, like, patriotism isn't the same as nationalism, but you get the gist there of what they were talking about. I'm curious your thoughts, like, and I think Haas, I think I've seen you talk about this, but do you feel as though a communist must be a patriot essentially must be like a communist because of the values that those two those two like points of view hold?
Yes, absolutely. I could ramble endlessly about why this, like, especially is true for Marxists, but I'm not going to, obviously. But like, you have to understand something. For Marx arrives at his humanism and the proletariat in a very beautiful way. Marx was a Hegelian, and Hegel, created this kind of this system, this philosophical system in which he encompasses all of being through the mind thinking and being really truly become one in Hegel's case. So Hegel is just dealing with what is purely within our ability from the perspective of thought, individual thought. And from that, he reconciles all of reality from the individual standpoint. For Marx to turn around and then say that here in the ingenious soil of the people, like the lowest denominator, the most kind of abandoned, accursed, landless and kind of deprived section of humanity, that this actually represents the point of true dialectical reconciliation. Marx was saying that Marx's humanist gesture means that the highest insights of thought, individual thought and morality and so on, were ultimately united with the reality of humanity, which means that communism is ultimately about the people. That is what it's about. It's not for an imagined people. It's not for a good people we think of in our head that doesn't exist in reality. It's not for a different specimen. It's for humanity, and specifically, it's for the people. The only context and meaning given to a communist is to serve the people. And the people obviously subsist within the context of a country, right? A people, if they're a people and not an imagined and abstract one, have a country. America is a country with a people, right? China's a country with a people. Russia's a country with a people. There is no meaning to communism, especially from the Marxist perspective, without being with, serving, and serving the people, what the people are. So patriotism has always just been a given for communists. Now, there's confusion because the Communist Manifesto famously says, the working man has no country. But you have to understand why they were saying that, because they had predicted within the Communist Manifesto that all distinctions in terms of borders and countries were being dissolved by capitalism, right? So, and they also predicted a lot of other things were being dissolved. Classes were being dissolved, and families were being dissolved, religion was being dissolved. They also predicted that, for the same reason, that the revolution was going to emerge in the advanced countries. Well, after the revolutions of 48, and the experience of history, Marx and Engels, they changed their understanding of what they were saying in the manifesto. Reality had proven them wrong. That the most advanced sections of the proletariat were not in England by the end of Marx and Engels' life. They were in Germany, right, which was the most backward country in Europe when they wrote the Communist Manifesto. And then Marx and Engels were anticipating that the revolution was going to start in Russia, right, which was the most backward of countries there. So, in essence, they were proven wrong about all national distinctions or distinctions between countries and borders and states being dissolved. For the same reason that they turned out to be wrong about a great deal many other things. But Marxism doesn't mean you elevate every word written in the Communist Manifesto to the status of a dogma. I mean, yes, in terms of what they were trying to say, they were right, right? They were right because the meaning of what they were saying was no country is eternal, no nation is eternal, and they are all subject to an eternal process of kind of transformation and so on. And that's kind of the wisdom of what they were trying to say. But the sad thing is that it's not like I'm just for the first time pointing this out. I mean, Marx and Engels themselves basically pointed this out. Marx said in the Critique of the Gotha program that the proletariat must take national form. It's national in form, class struggle in content. Lenin continued this, Stalin continued this, Mao continued this. So the history is already there, and the reasoning for it is already there. So yes, in short, communists must be patriots. If you're not a patriot, you're not a communist. Simple as that.
Well, I would like to say one thing, because, viewing this from a tactical point of view, okay? During the Vietnam War era, the United States in the 50s and 60s, up into the mid 70s, had a very booming economy. And there was a very big industrial working class in the United States. And that industrial working class saw their living standards dramatically increase after the Second World War. They were in depression conditions before the Second World War. The 1950s, things got way better. And because of that, a lot of workers' loyalty to empire was bought. And so the communists in the United States, from the Communist Party, from the Socialist Workers' Party, from the Workers' World Party, they had to make a tactical decision. How do we oppose this genocidal war in Vietnam? And at first, they tried to oppose that war on the basis of, proletarian class struggle, don't fight a boss's war, etc. But it didn't work. But they realized, though, that a lot of the people fighting in the Vietnam War, they were people who had grown up in this very comfortable middle class, right? And that going into the army and fighting a war is not the most comfortable thing. And it's not a lot of fun. And especially if you had more of a cushy middle class upbringing, it cannot be particularly good. And, military discipline is very harsh and such. So the anti-Vietnam War movement over the course of the Vietnam War learned to make kind of a middle class pacifist appeal. That was the way to win Americans to oppose the Vietnam War in that time. Okay, and they were right to do that. Trying to oppose it on a class basis when workers had a high standard of living, booming economy, wasn't going to work. That was the right thing to do in those situations. But you don't want to be a general fighting the last war, right? The Vietnam War ended a really long time ago. After the Vietnam War, there was something in the United States called the New Communist Movement. And that was the Revolutionary Communist Party and the Communist Workers' Party and the October League and other groups. And they went and got jobs in factories throughout the entire 1970s and tried to win their coworkers to communism, sold the newspapers in the plant. And a lot of their coworkers, again, there was still a very strong industrial middle class in the United States. A lot of their coworkers didn't want to hear it and said, go screw yourself, go back to Russia, you commie or whatever, because there was still a very strong industrial middle class. And then as you get to the end of the 1970s, you had the first major economic downturn. And so a lot of the communists thought, oh, wow, now they're going to listen to us. Now there's an economic downturn. Well, no, things had been getting better and better and better until suddenly they got worse. So, of course, the reaction of most of the working class was to get more conservative and to go, for the Ronald Reagan. You had the Reagan reaction. But after the Reagan reaction, you had a lot of those communists who had gotten their jobs in factories. They just retreated. They said, you know what? It can never be done, right? We tried it for 10 years. Throughout the course of the Vietnam War protest movement, we learned to make a middle class appeal. It can never be done. Average Americans can just never be won to socialism. Well, 1978, 1980, 1981, that was a really long time ago. And conditions have drastically changed since that time. And Lenin very famously said that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. And that the left in the United States has gotten used to operating in a period where there was enough of a booming economy, enough of a solid labor aristocracy. We assume that we're going to be this bohemian fringe, that the only people that are going to listen to us are college kids and hippies. There might be an alliance with the Black liberation struggle and the Black national movement, but for the most part, we're going to be a fringe element. So that is not the way to win. We're in a different period now. Capitalism is in crisis. The United States is falling apart. Interest in socialism is very widespread across the country. we could actually win now. But in order to win, we're going to have to update our tactics, right? The new left, the Vietnam War, the new communist movement of the 70s, that's all a long time ago. And we're now faced with a country full of people that are hungry, full of people that have seen their relatives locked in jail or died from opioids, full of people who have seen their relatives shot in Afghanistan or shot in Iraq or in Syria, and they're tired of it. And we need to find out how to make a populist appeal that we will fight for you. And again, that's not we're going to fight for you and make the country worse and tear things apart and light things on fire and beat people up. And no, we're going to fight for you by making a better country. And that we need to communicate to them that while we may not agree with how the United States was founded, we may not agree with all the awful things in the history of the United States, we want to make their lives better. We love them. And I will also add this. I've made this analogy before, but in legal terms, they talk about fruit of a poison tree, right? And that's the idea that, if a cop comes into your house and searches without a warrant, what he finds is not admissible because the way he acquired that evidence was impure. And so the result is impure. It is the fruit of a poison tree. And I've said many times that the United States, as it currently exists, is the fruit of a poison tree. It is tainted by the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and the Vietnam War and the Korean War and this extermination of Native Americans and the exploitation of the Chicano people and the theft of Mexico, of Texas and California from Mexico. The United States is definitely poisoned by all of that. And in the 1950s and 60s, despite that booming economy, all of those cars, all of those hula hoops and TV sets and refrigerators were dripping with blood. And that was the blood of the people around the world that were being exploited, the blood of the black people who were suffering under Jim Crow, the blood of the Chicano people, the blood of the indigenous people. And that in a lot of ways, the collapse of the United States that we're watching, the gradual deterioration of the country, is very much the chickens coming home to roost. And we can recognize this. None of this is incompatible with being a patriotic socialist. None of what I'm saying is contrary to being a patriotic socialist. Because one of the most key things that all progressive forces have done is they've recognized that what we are appealing to people to do is to change. We are telling people to change, right? We are telling people that the way we used to function as a society, the way the world works, doesn't work anymore. That we are telling people that we have to change and turn things around. And that's what communists have always done. Wherever they go and they tell people that used to think one way and used to act one way to act a different way. And now more than ever is the time to go to the American people and to say, the ideology we've been spoon-fed about individualism and capitalism, not going to work. That, national chauvinism and jingoism, not going to work. That support for these wars, not going to work. That belief that profits should come before people and free markets, not going to work. What are we doing if we are not going to people who disagree with us and getting them to change our minds? What are we doing at that point?
And
go ahead, Oz. Yeah.
Just really quick, what you said also is, I also think that, and this is one of just maybe my view, is that I think the Communist Party seriously underappreciated and did not really learn the real significance of the Popular Front, even in the post-war period. I think Mao actually gave new significance to the meaning of Popular Front in a way that the Soviet-aligned parties did not at the outset really accept. And I think when we look at it from the perspective of populism, the conservative instincts of American working class and working people, I don't think are in any way incompatible with a general kind of revolutionary or anti-establishment rejection of the Vietnam War. I think perhaps, maybe, I don't know, genuinely, I don't know, is that maybe communists, because the theory of the class struggle, remember, is institutionalized theory, right? It's a specific kind of Marxist theory that only the initiated understand. Trying to impose it on reality is not going to work, like in that period or in this period, right? But if they had a kind of more Maoist understanding of the significance of the Popular Front and interpreting the Popular Front from the perspective of populism, maybe it could have been possible that communists could have led the Nixon-Reagan rule a kind of uprising against the Democrats. Because ultimately, let's remember who started the Vietnam War. If I remember correctly, it was under a Democratic administration, right? And the Democrats at this time, it's very interesting, were starting to change their strategy from the working class Americans to appealing to marginal groups in an alliance with the professional managerials. So I think communists did have an opportunity, perhaps, at this time. Maybe they couldn't for historical reasons, but retrospectively, I think from a Maoist perspective, it could have been those Reagan Democrats who could have been the base for a communist anti-war populism. I don't know.
A lot of what the fake
Yeah.
left puts out these days is just anti-working class bigotry. I mean, you know, Vosh is a disgusting creature, a rich kid from Beverly Hills who thinks average working class people, when they get together and start organizing for their rights, are scary and authoritarian, and it triggers him. And oh my God. And that's what all of this equating of communism and fascism is really about, right? This is Hannah Arendt. This is the Congress for Cultural Freedom. This is Susan Sontag. What they really believe, it actually comes from Leo Strauss, the neocon philosopher, which is basically that there are these great people, the intellectuals, the philosopher kings, who are meant to rule over all of us. And everything must be done to protect these people's sacred right to rule over the rest of us. And whenever, you know, the rabble start getting together and demanding their rights and mobilizing and building mass movements and wearing uniforms and waving flags and making demands, whenever that happens, it must be crushed immediately, because that's Nazi Germany, that's communism, that's the labor movement. And they, in their minds, all populism is the same. Fascist, right-wing populism, left-wing economic populism is all the same, because it threatens their ability to rule over the rest of us. And that's what they really think when it really gets down to it. This is neocon philosophy. And on the right, it manifests itself with, you know, free market economics and, you know, hawkish foreign policy. On the left, it manifests itself in kind of social liberalism and the belief that average people are dangerous rednecks who need to be controlled. But at the end of the day, anti-populism is the essence of neocon philosophy. And that's what the synthetic left believes. It's essentially just politicized anti-populism. They are afraid of the masses of people. Vosh is a great example of that. I mean, he really just hates working class people. I mean, after January 6th, he tweeted out something to the effect of, these people can't coexist with a democratic society. Either they get disappeared or we all do. Right? So in the name of protecting his sacred freedom to live in Beverly Hills and read about anarcho-communism, he wants working class people who might support Trump to get dragged away in the middle of the night and taken to Guantanamo Bay, disappeared. We all know what that means. That's what Vosh wants. But he's lecturing us about freedom. And this is the irony, I guess you could say, of liberalism, is that liberalism is never afraid to utilize illiberal institutions to defend itself. You know, you couldn't have an open liberal society without an entity like the U.S. Army. And do you think the U.S. Army is a free-thinking institution? That drill sergeant, you know, everyone must think for themselves. Sir, yes, sir. You know, what is the meaning of truth? We don't know, sir, yes, sir. I mean, the liberalism is the class privilege of a privileged few, right? And it depends on very illiberal, authoritarian institutions to prop it up, okay? And they have contempt for these authoritarian, illiberal institutions. The military that goes out, you know, that Vosh wants to keep in Afghanistan, that military is people from red states, okay? Largely, it's people from red states. It's those people he hates. He wants to send them to Afghanistan to go fight for the women, okay? You know, this is the irony of the whole thing, is that this is very much a class divide. The synthetic left is the middle class, you know, reviling in contempt for the broad masses of workers who are going to mobilize and are going to fight for their rights. And I would like to see them fight for their rights on the basis of a progressive, anti-racist, anti-imperialist program. And if that's not the case, their alienation could express itself in a vulgar right-wing way. And I would like to see that not happen. So, you know, I think we're on the right path here, but I'm sure, you know, Bosch would disagree.
Yeah. Speaking of people like Vosh, I see like a lot of the arguments from the other side of the spectrum on this debate coming from the same type of people that promote like very heavily like woke cancel culture ideology. Curious your thoughts on because okay, also like as we discussed earlier, being a patriotic Marxist-Leninist, patriotic communist, that was the norm historically wherever you saw these popular movements take place. So I'm curious your thoughts on where the American left decided to reject that notion that that should be the norm, and how it's kind of shifted into what it is today. This like now it's like a woke cancel culture, and like no, this you're gonna get canceled if you say you're a patriot. But where did it begin in American culture? Because it wasn't always like this.
So Caleb has like a very in-depth background of knowledge. I have a kind of narrative myself, but if he wants to go first, then that'd be fine.
Sure. Well, I mean, when you talk about, I mean, I guess to give expression to what you were talking about, I tweeted out, it used to be, or I tweeted out that leftists are mad about wars, poverty, inequality, etc. And it seems that synthetic leftists are not mad about wars, poverty, and inequality. They're mad that working class people are mad about wars, poverty, and inequality in a politically incorrect way. And that, largely, if you look at, I remember, way back when I was like 19 years old, I went to the US Social Forum, which was this left-wing gathering they had in Atlanta, Georgia. They had two of them. They had another one a couple years later in Detroit. And I had been reading communist stuff. I'm from a small town in Ohio. And I went to the US Social Forum, and all the different communist, Maoist, Trotskyist, anarchist groups are there. But there were a lot of young folks there at this US Social Forum who had piercings, body piercings, and they worked at Planned Parenthood or the ACLU or Students Against Sweatshops or some kind of NGO. And they had piercings, and they were talking this ideology that didn't sound like anything I'd ever read in communist theory. And it was about white skin privilege, and it was about gender oppression, and it was about intersectionality. And they were talking this totally different language. And they were making quite a bit of money at their NGO liberal jobs, and they had their nose piercings, and it's weird. A lot of them had gone to Ivy League schools, Harvard and Yale and Stanford and places like that. And I remember even back then thinking, who are these people? Why is this isn't the same thing as communism? This isn't what I've read in William Z. Foster. This isn't what I've read in Mao's Little Red Book. This is something different. And what that ideology is, that the NGO-cialists, I like to call them, or the synthetic left, really, what they espouse, this stuff started at the elite Ivy League schools, and it was really training for the business class, right? And it's basically that if you own a big corporation in the United States and you go to do business in Africa and you act like a racist asshole, and you speak to people in a condescending way, and you don't acknowledge their culture and their history, you're not going to do a very good job, and you're going to hurt the image of the United States around the world. And this was about getting the business community here in the United States and getting people from these upper middle class backgrounds to go to the developing world and interact with them in a more kind of polite way. And these NGOs were built by the CIA and all of that. And it was about trying to kind of revamp and reinvent the image of the United States. And the height of that was the election of Barack Hussein Obama as president of the United States, right? We had a president of the United States who was not white and had a Muslim middle name and had gone to a Muslim school. How do you think the Arab Spring would have gone if George W. Bush had been in office during it? Things would be very differently. But it's only because Barack Obama was president of the United States that the USA was able to co-opt the Arab Spring and turn it into the destruction of Libya, the most prosperous country on the African continent, turn it into a civil war in Syria. The USA was able to hijack the Arab Spring because they worked really hard on tweaking the optics of imperialism. And that's what intersectionality is, and that's what white skin privilege is. This is all just tweaking the optics of imperialism. It is sensitivity training for the lieutenants of empire. It's go to the developing world and don't act like an asshole, and hire people of different races, and hire people of different genders, and make sure you're representative, and learn. That's all this is. It's not Marxism, it's not socialism, it's not communism. I think that needs to be said. Now, as far as the thing about the Popular Front, I can't resist going down this rabbit hole, because every time I bring this up, some wise guy who thinks he knows everything, he's like really well read about Marxism, says, you want to be a patriotic socialism. Well, that's called Browderism. What you're doing, you're reviving Earl Browder. I've read a book. See, I know all about this. No, you haven't read a book. Go read William Z. Foster's History of the Communist Party of the United States. Go read The Struggle Against Revisionism. Go read the pamphlets from the anti-Browder campaign. Earl Browder's deviation was not that he was advocating American patriotism. The whole American Communist Party did that for the whole time, from the time it was founded up until that time. Earl Browder's deviation was that he opposed strikes. He wanted to prolong the wartime strike pledge of World War II. He didn't want to end it. He wanted it to keep going. That he said that U.S. imperialism was progressive in Latin America. He supported American imperialism against Juan Perón and other nationalist leaders in Latin America. He opposed the independence of Puerto Rico. He said that Black people did not constitute a nation. Earl Browder's deviation and his dissolving of the Communist Party and changing it to the Communist Political Association was far, far more wide-reaching than just patriotism. Yes, Earl Browder was into the American patriotism thing, and that was part of the way the Popular Front was implemented in the United States. But any other communist leader would have done the same thing, and the French communists did that. And the Spanish communists did that during the Spanish Civil War, and the British communists did that. And that to say that is Browderism is just juvenile, and it's just a complete. It's very, very naive. And that in many cases you have the Maoist movement. They're trying to explain away how the Communist Party, when it was good, was doing things that they say are the opposite of what they do, and so they've just made Earl Browder the fall guy for the policies that were widely practiced and implemented. And I will add that, one writer I really admire and respect is Nelson Peary, an African-American communist. And Nelson Peary advocates proletarian patriotism. You read his writings, he advocates appealing to people on a patriotic basis. African-American communist, Maoist, kicked out of the Communist Party during the 1950s, went on to form the Communist Labor Party. He very much is an advocate of proletarian patriotism. And despite the fact that he's an advocate of self-determination for the Black Belt, he didn't see a contradiction there. And it's quite interesting because, who else was an advocate of this kind of stuff was the Black Panthers, right? Go to listen to the Black Panthers talk. The Black Panthers aligned themselves not only with Puerto Rican organizations and Chicano organizations, they aligned themselves with a white organization called the Young Patriots. And the Young Patriots, I might add, they did something that I would never do. I think it was a big mistake. They actually had the Confederate flag as their symbol. Now, I am opposed to the Confederate flag. I think it's an offensive symbol. But they aligned with a group of young white people, working class white people from Chicago and Appalachia, who were organized, fighting imperialism, aligned with the Black Panthers, and called themselves the Young Patriots. Now, could you imagine if we started a communist group now called the Young Patriots? I mean, we would be destroyed. People would kill us. But the Black Panthers had no problem aligning with them because the Black Panthers understood that this was going to be on the basis of a class struggle, right? And that is what is completely missing. Class struggle politics, populism. We are fighting for the broad majority of American people against a billionaire monopolist elite that has destroyed this country economically, that sends our children off to die in wars, that is looting the place, that is driving us into poverty. The destiny of the American people is in solidarity with the people of the world against the big corporations and banks. And that needs to be our message. It is our job as communists in the center of the empire to convince the American people that it is in their interests to stand against imperialism. If we're not doing that, we are not doing our jobs.
Also I wanted to add regarding the origins of this current left. It's I think something happened specifically in the post-war period in the United States, or maybe even earlier than then, which has a lot to do. It's a confusion of Marxist theory, where the material class struggle was confused and kind of conflated with something that really belonged to the sphere of information and media theory proper. So you have this distinction between the material objectivity of the class struggle and the manner by which the knowledge of the class struggle is disseminated, right? The consciousness of the class struggle, right? These are two crucial distinctions that I think may have been taken for granted. At a certain point, the United States became more of a kind of economy of signals and information and mass media. And there was an increased level of what they call in Marxism socialization, which basically means you had this kind of economization of spheres of life that previously weren't, like communities and cities and things like that. And this gave rise to the emergence of a specific class of how should I put it? An institutionalized class of the American, which was an arm of the American, let's say, deep state, whatever the deep state was at that time. And these institutions also fostered a specific and unique view of their relationship to the American people, which was one of social engineering. So the kind of post-New Deal and New Deal social engineers and kind of technocrats increasingly adopted a perspective of what is rationally contrived within an institutional setting versus the actual material reality of the people. This was like their primary contradiction they were trying to overcome. And also not just rationally contrived, but like, what is the site of the free use of moral and intellectual and philosophical whatever thought? Now, when the Vietnam War came, I think this was a crucial period. The progressive forces struggled with developing and cultivating a basis for the opposition toward the war that was beyond mere individual morality. We could clearly see this was an immoral war. I mean, that's very much clear to everyone. I'm not denying that. But morality is not enough to convince the masses, to win the masses, right? Unless we're speaking about the middle classes, who have the kind of free time to be moral, contemplate and care about these kind of acculturated moral issues. So increasingly, I'm skipping a lot of stuff, but increasingly, leftism had to become associated with middle class moralism and hyper reflexivity, which basically means it was no longer something forged in the kind of material senses of the American people, their kind of intuitions and so on. It was forged from the perspective of reflexive institutions. This inevitably corresponded with the fact that leftists increasingly had to align themselves with Democrats because all expressions of reactionary tendencies were obviously coming from the rural America and the working class with their conservative instincts. Leftists didn't recognize that if communists do not lead the rural working class, reactionary elements will be the spontaneous form of socialism, right? Marx and Engels talk about reactionary socialism, feudal socialism, and this is what we were starting to see with the reactionary populism in the post-war period. I would even argue to an extent maybe this was some of the basis of McCarthyism and the John Birch Society and all this kind of stuff, right? So I think there was a kind of confusion of the meaning of the Popular Front, where communists believed the Popular Front means you stand behind the institutions that represent the people, and you don't create an alternative organ for representing the people. Like that we have to rally behind the Democrats because they represent the popular elements. Well, actually, no, they don't represent the popular elements of America. At least by the time of the counterculture, they stopped doing that. They're on their way to stop doing that. They represented a representation of the popular interests of America, which is a very crucial distinction. But at a certain point, the American left and communists as a whole, faced with the inability to transmute the consciousness of the class struggle and the precepts of communism and Marxism, the only way they could kind of spread this ideology was within an institutional setting where people take thoughts and theories as the premise of their daily lives. Like, who is going to take as the premise of their daily lives ideologies, right? It's going to be people who exist within institutional settings, who make their daily bread, being paid to spread ideas and write and read and research and things like that. And also to be part of, Scala pointed out, NGOs, social engineers, activist groups, and these kind of interests, corporate and business culture interests. So there was this inability to understand that the consciousness of the class struggle is not the same thing as the actual essential site of the class struggle. Like, it's one thing to know what class struggle is. It's another thing to recognize where it actually is happening in reality. And in my view, Marxists and Marxist-Leninists within America, even Marxist-Leninists, I mean, this is especially true for the more extreme ones like Maoists, those type of people. They completely lost the ability to make this distinction. So when they would go to the workers, for example, or working class people with their special ideology and ideas, and workers just flat out reject this, they would go, "Oh, this is proof that these are a reactionary class. They're not accepting my special theory and ideology." But your special theory and ideology has no content. You're not making a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. When you're speaking to people about Marxism and the class struggle, that they're just going to see you as an academic and an intellectual who's coming from the universities trying to socially engineer their lives. But if you expound the insights of Marxism into a concrete analysis, and specifically from the perspective of media and information theory, a concrete understanding of what the real content of America's working class interests are, you will be able to scientifically arrive at a message that does resonate with America's working people and which does allow communists to really lead as a popular force and not a force confined to institutions or the marginal fringe, right, of people with piercings and this crazy kind of stuff. So, to me, I think we require a comprehensive reevaluation of the post-war period specifically, um, because I think, especially around the Sino-Soviet conflict, a really big air of confusion and uncertainty was thrusted upon communists within the West and within America that I don't think has been resolved as of yet. So we must have a comprehensive reevaluation, and that's why I also say, speaking in regards to existing parties like the Communist Party, they should reevaluate the significance of the Popular Front, right? Maybe the Popular Front was the correct strategy, right, in the 30s and so on. But what does it mean to be faithful to that strategy of the Popular Front? Does it mean trailing behind the Democrats, or might it mean forming alliances with new third-party initiatives like the People's Party and things like that? So I think that is really the crucial question when it comes to what are the origins of this kind of synthetic, fake left, which is really a bourgeois, a force of bourgeois consciousness and culture. And how can communists overcome the mistake of having fallen into the trap of aligning themselves with it in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Caleb, do you have time for one more question? I don't want to keep you too long.
Sure.
I know Haas will probably be streaming all night, but this is actually a question for the both of you, from a super chatter, Chaya, who asked, I don't know if you've read the book. I know you're familiar with their ideas, but they said, what's the biggest thing Jay Sakai gets wrong in his Settlers book?
Well, for me, I would say that he takes a problem in US society that is very real, and he makes it something that therefore leads to the conclusion that it is never possible that we could have socialism, right? He takes some very, very, very true things, and there is some misrepresentation in the book. He misquotes William Z. Foster intentionally, distorts what William Z. Foster is saying at one point to make William Z. Foster look deeply insensitive and racist, when if you read the context of the paragraph, he was clearly not saying what he says. And it's a book that is problematic in many ways. But the main thing is it points to true things. There is racism among the white working class of the United States. There is a history of settler colonialism, and what you can call settler populism with Andrew Jackson and other things is very problematic. However, the world is constantly changing. A does not equal A. Tomorrow is not the same as today, and the world is constantly in flux. And for him to take that, the arguments that he makes there basically lead to the conclusion that it's hopeless, that you can't do anything, that there is no hope. And I must say, who is Jay Sakai? Nobody knows. He's just there's some interviews on the internet. There's some articles that have been posted around. Very mysterious. That book is from the 1980s. It's been floating around. There was this weird, very secretive communist group for a while called MIM, or the Maoist Internationalist Movement, that was circulating that book among prisoners. throughout the 90s and such. And that book is a very strange book. It kind of appeared out of nowhere. The author, is he still alive? Is he still writing stuff? There's a couple articles. There's some like interviews where you can hear his voice. That's it. No one knows who he is. No one knows where he came from. That book is everywhere. And anarchists, mind you, the same kind of people who think that anyone who admires Mao is the same as a neo-Nazi, anyone who admires Stalin is a neo-Nazi, are printing this book by this so-called Maoist and circulating it around because it's just so important that we get people to understand that there's no hope for revolution in the United States because all the white people are inherently evil Euro settlers. Very mysterious, right? And look, let's be real, okay? I don't want to be paranoid, and I'm not leveling any allegations. I just want to say that if I was the US government, I would want every communist in the United States to get settlers shoved down their throat. It's the best thing you could give to a communist in the United States. You want to convince people that there's no hope, don't go out and organize, don't build a revolutionary movement. That's the book to read. It is the most demoralizing, it is the most effective piece of propaganda. And the fact that no one really knows who the author is, the fact that people who hate communists, people who advocate violence against communists, the Antifa anarchist crowd, are distributing that book, even though they hate, in theory, they hate the people who wrote it. The fact that that book is everywhere. You can't go to any communist space, communism, Reddit, everywhere this book is. And it leads you to the conclusion that there's no hope. You shouldn't do anything. Very mysterious. Very, very mysterious, right? And that, the US government goes all over the world carrying out all kinds of psychological operations and disinformation campaigns to try and prevent communist revolutions. Do you think that they wouldn't take big efforts to try and control the left in the United States? And again, I saw that book floating around among prisoners when I was doing prison activism in Ohio. And it was very weird, and people didn't know where it came from. And the group MIM, the Maoist Internationalist Movement, that was distributing it, it was founded by a guy named Henry Park, who mysteriously died, and he had some kind of psychological breakdown, and no one ever saw him either. You would just see his newspaper left around places. Very shady history there with that book. Very shady history. I don't know what's happened. Maybe the documents will be released 50 years from now. I'm very, very, very suspicious of that book. I must say I'm highly suspicious of it. And when someone showed me, I admire William Z. Foster. He was probably the greatest communist in American history. And when someone showed me how intentionally they lied to make it look like he was being blatantly racist, when if you read the full paragraph, he was saying pretty much the exact opposite of what they quoted him as saying. At that point, I was just shocked. That's the work. It struck me as this is not coming from a good place. This isn't a communist who's just frustrated with the white working class and has come to some negative conclusions. There's a sinister agenda here at work. There's people being manipulated. I have very negative feelings about that book and the role that it's played. And I must add, my final thought, I'm a little long-winded tonight, but have you ever noticed that it seems like all the third worldists, for the most part, are white? It's the weirdest thing. I've met so many communists of color that are African-American or Latino or whatever, and they seem to have no problem having white workers and black workers stand arm in arm. And they, but it's this white, and it tends to be white people from like upper middle class backgrounds who are the ones that are most attracted to this idea that white people are inherently reactionary and stuff. You would think it would be people of color that would come to this conclusion based on the racism they've experienced, but it's actually a very middle class thing. And before it was put into words with settlers and stuff like that, the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, this was their excuse for doing their bombing campaign, their ultra-left adventurous bombing campaigns. They said, the white people are all pigs, they're all bought off, they're not hip and revolutionary, and, the white youth must choose sides now, and all of this. Look at who the Weathermen were, right? Look at who the Weathermen were, right? Bill Ayers, Bill Ayers, who was later he's just a Democrat now, a friend of Barack Obama, but he was this big Weather Underground bombing guy. His family, they are the richest family in Chicago. You want to talk about a family that comes from money. Bernadine Dorn, very, very wealthy. Mark Rudd, very, very wealthy background. These are not working class people who got frustrated with the other workers. This is very much a kind of upper middle class deviation to add to the mysteriousness of that book in particular. So again, anti-populism is toxic. Get rid of anti-populism. That's the neocons. That's Leo Strauss. That's the Congress for Cultural Freedom, Hannah Arendt, Susan Sontag, Irving Kristol, CIA money. This is not our movement. Communism has been a popular movement, fighting for the people against empire.
Yeah, the way I would put it the way I'd have to put it is basically, so Jay Sakai, he talks about he's going into the real dirty history of the origins of the American people and settlers and all this thing. Now, leaving that aside for one quick second, it's really interesting how at the same time that Jay Sakai is engaging in this kind of historical reductionism and all this kind of stuff, he treats himself as a free, rational agent, completely talking from the abyss and from the aether. Jay Sakai doesn't believe that ideological and intellectual reflexivity has a material basis. If he did believe that, he would recognize that the ability to be given this insight, this consciousness he's trying to foster, right? That rests on the basis of a specific, not only a specific class, but a specific people. There's only a specific type of people, as a general trend, who are soaking this stuff up. And as Caleb pointed it out, it's majority white leftists. It's white people, white leftists, who see this hyper criticism and hyper reflexivity as a way of avoiding the material premises of, I guess, their own people, which is the working class. If they can estrange themselves from the working class, they can maintain their comfortable class position as purely institutional and purely reflexive classes without ever being forced to confront their real material, the real material basis of their class. Like, it is the sweat and labor of America's working people that feeds academics and professional managerials and institutionalized people. And by cutting themselves off from the popular majority in the broad strata, they are cutting off the possibility of their privileged social position ever being threatened. They always are hypercritical against white people and all this stuff, because what they're basically saying is, we are the real white people in charge. Like, they have a monopoly on being the preeminent white people in power. Basically, they have this issue with America's working class. Like, you know, during the New Deal, when FDR he brought down farmers from Texas, he brought up farmers from Texas, and he gave them positions in government. Right? People who they want to prevent America's working people, the rural people, from having any of the opportunities, because at the end of the day, this is a very mediocre class of people who are just not talented, not very bright, not very original, not very creative, and nothing would eliminate their class basis more than opening the gatekeeping ramparts and allowing in some real, genuine, and authentic talent and intelligence and creativity to pour in from the popular majority. So this is kind of a very common theme throughout the history of kind of elites trying to, you know, be more morally pure than masses, right? It's a form of gatekeeping, basically. And another thing too is that, you know, what Jay Sakai gets especially wrong, his whole entire idea of settlers is wrong, because Lenin already pointed out that there is no pure proletariat. A proletariat is always entwined with a democratic petty bourgeoisie. The proletarianization is when you are stripped of all land and you have nothing to sell but your labor. Historically speaking, this was never a permanent phrase. There's always some kind of return to some kind of stability. When during the war and in the crisis in the Russian Empire, the factory proletariat went and returned to cultivate their landed plots that they had in the country, right? There's always this kind of duality of the proletariat on the one hand and this kind of peasantry on the other hand that manages to persist even beyond the agricultural peasantry. We have the case of the middle class, so-called middle class, the post-war baby boomers who had their suburban homes and their white picket fences and cars. And the same is true for the period of the 19th century. You had settlers, right, who had their own plot. Marx also described them in Capital. They were able to subsist on the basis of their own kind of private property, who at the same time were being subject to proletarianization. Now, Sakai dismisses this class as a bunch of immoral settlers stealing indigenous land, but that's not the only thing that defined this specific class. What also defined this specific class was, as Marx was describing, their means of subsistence, right? And which also made them the base of not only the Jacksonian populism, which of course had many problematic, racist, and also so on problems, but also phenomena like the Farmers Alliance and which would become the People's Party, which cemented an alliance between the so-called settlers relevant to Jay Sakai, small white farmers, and also black Republicans who also had their own small farms and wanted to create a movement to build infrastructure and to get off the gold standard and things like that, which would benefit the overwhelming majority of America's people. So Sakai basically commits the error of saying because they are settlers who in effect often participated in the wholesale theft of indigenous land, that this means that's all they were, and that's what you can reduce the entire genesis of the American people to. When in fact that's a detail and an aspect, but it's not actually what primarily defined the genesis of what we call the American people proper. It's a horrible aspect and a horrible fact of the history, but to reduce it to that is to refuse to engage in a materialist analysis of how this class actually was reproducing itself and constituting itself materially. So that's my criticism of Sakai.
Can I make
Very
one
well said.
last quick point?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. We published at the Center for Political Innovation our textbook. It's called We Are City Builders, the Center for Political Innovation Educational Manual. And we included in it a very important piece called Talk on the Question of Philosophy by Mao Zedong. And it is one of the rare examples of Mao kind of off script, where it's a transcript of Mao speaking to a group of college students about philosophy. And I included it. And the reason I included it is because if you read that speech, Talk on the Question of Philosophy, Mao Zedong, 1964, that's who Mao really was. Mao was a mass organizer. Mao knew how to talk to people. Mao told jokes. Mao told stories. Mao knew how to interact with people. He begins that speech by telling the young people there, he says, go to the countryside. That's where you're going to get your real education, is by being among the people. And that's what communists need to do. If you can go to the people, if you can start pushing revolutionary ideas, if you can start building organizations, you will break out of this internet edgelord culture. And you'll understand why proletarian patriotism is not a bad thing if done in a rational, anti-imperialist, anti-racist way. Learning comes from the masses to the masses. The revolutionaries are the fish and the masses are the water. That's what Mao Zedong said. That's the approach that we need to have. From the masses to the masses, leading while learning, learning while leading. If we can develop that kind of approach, we can develop a mass line that will eventually lead to the overturning of capitalism in the United States by building a mass movement of working people.
Very well said. Thank you both so much for your time. I don't want to hold you any longer. I know we've been talking for a while, but I feel like we hit a lot of really good topics. I feel like we hammered out this, this debate from a side that hasn't been discussed too much online yet. But I feel like it's very well represented. I mean, if you guys saw the breakdown of the tweet that I initially sent out, it was kind of split 50-50, to be honest, which I didn't initially think it was going to be controversial, but it was. And then I was actually kind of surprised at how split things were. So, hopefully, if there were people on that side of the spectrum that were thinking, you can't be a patriot and a Marxist-Leninist and an anti-imperialist all at the same time, maybe now if they've watched this, either in this live stream or if someone else is reacting to this further down the line, you will understand that, yes, it is very possible. And actually it is the only correct stance to have when you look at the values of what being a patriot really means. So thank you again. I've included links to both of your channels, Twitters, in the pinned comment on this chat. So if anyone watching wants to go follow, go do so. And I encourage you to do so. Do you have any last words or where people can follow you and find you?
I will just say we need a government of action that will fight for working families. And that will lead us eventually to the development of socialism with American characteristics. The kind of socialism that works in China is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. It is uniquely applied to China's conditions. And when socialism comes to the United States, it will be a socialism with American characteristics. I'm not sure what those American characteristics will be, and that will be developed in the course of building a mass movement and in the course of struggle. But it will be a unique brand of socialism. And if you don't recognize that, you're clueless.
Pause.
I guess I will just leave something that might be a little controversial, but it's just my personal opinion. I really see great value in the Communist Party of the USA. I disagree greatly with the strategy they have taken for a very long time, but this is a party that's over 100 years old. It's tried and tested against every form of ultra left fanaticism and infantilism, and I think it requires a comprehensive reevaluation and internal criticism. I really think that it can be a platform for American communists to congregate around, because it is the Communist Party, in my view. It is the original Communist Party of the USA, and I view it. Perhaps I could be wrong. I'm willing to be proven wrong, but I do see a future in it, as far as like potential is concerned. So I guess I'll just say that. I don't know. But yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And I think everyone from what I've seen in the chat really enjoyed this. So hopefully it's not the last time. You're both always, of course, welcome back on. And I look forward to building this with all of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. I'll catch you guys later.